What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, what I do and what I have done, and then I think it can be most beneficial if I just let you ask questions, because it's my understanding that all of you are interested in pursuing some aspect of a broadcasting career. And nowadays, of course, it's so much more expansive than it ever was when I began. When I began, we used film. And I'll just tell you one story, and then I'll go back in time a little more. When I started at Channel 5, there were big film cameras. There was no mini cams, there was no videotape, there were no satellite trucks. There were big film cameras that went out and shot news, brought it back to the station. True story, the film was taken out of the camera and tossed in a vat of chemicals. A vat where it took an hour to develop it. This is the old days of film developing, same thing that happened with snapshots. And so you waited an hour for your film to come out of the soup, as we called it, and then it got hung up in a room, an editing room, hung up with two different reels of film, known as the A reel and the B reel, which led to the term B-roll. One was the pictures, one was the interviews, and an editor with a scissors and tape sat in there and cut the pictures out and cut the sound bites out and stitched it together on tape, and then it went into the studio and then you put on television. Think of that from a time standpoint. There was a lag of an hour or two every day. Fast forward 25 years, I'm on the air live from Havana, Cuba, from Jerusalem, Israel, from Amman, Jordan, from Mexico, from Canada, from the places I travel, from Ireland, from England, live all over the world. And nowadays, you don't even need the satellite trucks. There's digital facilities where you can just go right into the digital play area and pop up any place anybody has a computer. So things have indeed changed. What hasn't changed is that the same basic tools are required to succeed in this business as are required in any other business. And the reason I mentioned Bill and the fact that he stayed on me is to emphasize the fact that, in my opinion, there are few things more important to success in this business than persistence. The willingness to keep going after stories or interviews or whatever, and to never take no personally, and to never take no as no. One little rule of thumb. One reason I think I have had a relatively successful career is that I'm very persistent. Now, I fell into the news business by accident in 1972. I had no intentions of going into the news business. I had no idea what I wanted to do. Many of you have probably heard from your parents, maybe even your grandparents by this time, about a generation known as the 60s, which was one of the most iconic and famous of our generations for a whole lot of things: civil rights, assassinations, the drug culture, the hippies, the whole thing, peace, love, and everything else. But it was also a time of great confusion for a lot of people, and I was one of those people who lost focus and wasn't sure what I was going to do. I came from a good family. My mother was a writer and a journalist. I should have known from the get-go that this is where I was going. I could always write well. But I was thrown off by the 60s, and by the time I finished college in 1971, I went to 5 colleges, started out at a fancy Eastern school known as Colgate University, which is a quasi-Ivy League school, then matriculated on to the University of Wisconsin, back here to Roosevelt, Loyola, and finally finished at UIC. 5 colleges, 6 years, and a lot of wear and tear. But the reason I'm telling you all this is that I walked out of the UIC with a degree, never having had a journalism course, never having taken a single course in this field, and not having any idea what I wanted to do. Point number 2 is, it doesn't always, but it frequently takes help of some sort to get in that first door. It really makes a big difference if somebody can open door number 1. Door number 1 does not guarantee that you go to doors 2 or 3. Many people get in door number 1 and they're stuck in door number 1 and never get out, and that's not fulfilling because it gets old. It revolves around. Door number 1 is a revolving door. So I took this opportunity and I ran with it. I found opportunities to freelance write. I learned all the beats that you cover at the City News Bureau. And then I started calling the bosses at the Chicago Sun-Times every week asking for a job. Ultimate pestiness. Week after week, talked to secretaries, got to know them well, and finally, after about 6 months of persistence, I was given a job in the business section of the Chicago Sun-Times in 1972. I mentioned to you that I had never taken a journalism course in college. Well, when I got to the business section of the Chicago Sun-Times, I had never read a business section. I cared nothing about business. I was a hippie-ish type from the 60s, business, So I got to the Sun-Times as a business reporter because I was a good writer and I was a promising young man and I was smart enough. I spent 6 weeks before I started that job, 6 weeks reading every business publication I could get my hands on. Things I'd never heard of. The Wall Street Journal, what's that? Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, one after another. And so by the time I got to the Sun-Times, I had a rudimentary knowledge of business and I began to write there, and that's what I did for 6 months, and I went on to other things. How did I get from the Sun-Times to a TV job? That's unusual in Chicago. You don't normally go from print to the television world in a market this size. You normally go to Podunk and Podunk 2 and Podunk 3, and maybe you end up on TV down the road if things break well. Well, I went from the Sun-Times to a television job at Channel 5, in part by the same kind of conniving, I would say, smart, manipulative way. Channel 5 hired a new management team, a new general manager, a new news director, and they were looking to move to Chicago from New York and wondering where they should live for good schools for their kids. And they asked somebody at Channel 5, well, what do you know about the schools? And someone said, hey, you should talk to that Andy Shaw. He's the education writer at the Sun-Times. He really does a good job. He seems to know this stuff. I had been a pretty good education writer, won a number of awards in a year. And so I got a call from the general manager of NBC, who was going to be moving to Chicago, and he named Lee Hanna. He says, I hear that you know a lot about schools. We're moving out. Any idea where we should go for good schools for the kids? I said, I'll get back to you tomorrow. I spent the next 12 hours researching schools in the Chicago area. Racial and ethnic composition, test scores, graduation rates, college placements. When I called him back the next day, I looked like U.S. News and World Report with the college survey. I had all that information about whether we should go down if we wanted to live south, Homewood, Flossmoor, and up north, Evanston, Oak Park, New Trier, et cetera, et cetera. All those things, proportions of white, black, Hispanic, Jewish, Christian, all the things people were interested in. He was really pleased. And he said to me, is there anything I can ever do for you? I said, well, I've always thought it might be fun to try television, so if you ever decide you want to cover education on television, seriously, it's what I do at the Sun-Times, I'd love to try out. They came to town, gave me a tryout, I got a job. And then I just moved through journalism the rest of the way. 7 years at Channel 5, including all the reporting one does, a year and a half as the editorial director, something that doesn't exist in television anymore. This was back in the days when the FCC enforced what they called the Fairness Doctrine. There used to be something called the Fairness Doctrine in broadcasting, which essentially said that because these licenses are given out to the government, by the government, to private entities to basically own the television, the airwaves, they had to give something back to the people. So the Fairness Doctrine required equal time for different points of view, but it also said you had to have some public service in broadcasting. And among the things that TV stations did was to do the TV equivalent of editorials in newspapers. And so someone would go on the air and give a point of view. I did that for a year and a half. And then after that, I moved on to Channel 7, covered politics for 26 years. And at 5 and 7, that's where I combined to do a total of 15,000 stories.